Hi everyone. Today we're going to just do a very quick review of traditional proportions, and then we will do a couple of human figures or fantasy figures based on fantastical proportions. So to begin with here, I have the 8-head scale, which we talked about in the previous session on traditional proportion. We have the top, we have the bottom, we have the halfway point. And so using this scale, we'll bring the figure here real quickly, and we'll start off by adding the head. And then if you remember, when we come down, we add the thoracic cage. So we'll just block this in real quick. And then the halfway point is where the bottom portion of the pelvis is going to be placed, and the top portion comes above. So we have the pubic symphysis area would be right in here. And it's helpful when you're thinking of the proportions to always think of this portion of the pelvis being the halfway point. Then we take this bottom section, divide this in half, and that's going to let us know where the knees will be placed. And then down here is where the bottom of the feet will be placed. So just doing this real quick. Once we have that kind of navigated, then we can start to add the other information. And a little neck in here, indication of the head. Then we have the clavicles. And this portion of the pelvis comes up in here. This portion of the pelvis will come up in here. And right there is where we want to have the great trochanter and this lower section of the pelvis. And the femur. And a quick indication of the lower limb, and then we will place the wedge-shaped section of the foot. And then let's have, so remember where the pelvis comes out in here, we'll have the head of the humerus. And right in here, the medial epicondyle comes in right about to where the top portion of the pelvis is. So remember, we always want to make sure that we don't make the arms too short. And the lower arm, the radius and the ulna down here, and a little gesture indication of a hand. And we have the little, this portion of the pelvis. So now we can put a little more detail in here. So we have the lesser trochanter on the inside. Remember, the bones get thinner as they go through, then thicker as we approach the outside. And here's the patella right here at the halfway point. And we have the tibia, medial malleolus, then we have the head of the fibula, the lateral malleolus, and same on the other side. We have the lesser trochanter, we have the great trochanter. So even though I'm doing a quick gesture in here, I'm always trying to keep in mind the articulation of the anatomical points. So we have the tibia, medial malleolus, tibia in here, and the head of the fibula, lateral malleolus, and this makes kind of a little arch over the tarsal bones, and then just a quick indication of a wedge-shaped, the feet. We don't need to put in all the detail at this point. We'll be getting to feet later on. This is just for purposes of proportion. So here we have the patella on the other side. And then we have the head of the femur, and the ball is in here. And just a loose indication here of the pelvis, and show that little top area in there. The sacrum would be in here on the inside. And thoracic cage, we have the that section in there, xiphoid process. Then we have the manubrium, gladiolus, coming down here to the xiphoid process. And in the front, we see the ribs. We'll be getting to the anatomy of the ribs here, probably the next session, actually after this. So then we have the head of the humerus, ball and socket, connect in there. We have the clavicle, and the cervical vertebrae, the head, egg-shaped oval, a little wider on the top. Then we have the radius. You see a little bit of the ulna underneath. Radius. And ulna in here. Do a quick gesture of the hand, thumb, maybe a couple fingers, thumb. And so there we have it. So there's the human figure. Let's see, the eye, we'll just do a quick, a little bit here of the eye socket. The nasal cavity would be in here. The mouth would be in there. We don't need to do all the detail in this. That's not important, but we'll just do this to show the skull. And the opening of the nose. The maxilla would come in here. And then we'd have the mandible. So that's the human head. A heads of the human figure. Here's our first head, the human head right here. Then the next head would fall down right about in here, the opening. So when you're drawing the human figure, if you're drawing from a model, you want to look for this portion for the second head. The third head falls in here. The fourth head falls in here. This is the halfway point of the human figure. Good landmark to always be thinking of is where the bone sticks out here on the side, the great trochanter, and the pubic symphysis bone that runs right across this front section here. Then we have, when we break the lower extremities in half, usually our knees fall more or less at the halfway point, and then the ankles down here, and then we have our wedge-shaped feet. Remember, when you're drawing the arms, most people have a tendency to make these too short. Your elbow here on the inside comes down almost to the top, the crest of our pelvis, and our wrists fall down in the lower portion below our great trochanter, and then the hands fall that. Almost not quite to where our patella is, but pretty close. So remember, when you're drawing the human figure, it's always better to make the arms slightly too long, make the legs slightly too long. If you're going to be wrong too long. When drawing the hands and the feet, if you're going to be wrong, always make them too large as opposed to too small, unless you're doing fantastic fantasy type characters. And the head, if you're going to be wrong, it's always better to make the head too small rather than too large. So now we're going to have a little fun with this. So now we're going to do the anatomy of the dwarf. All right, so the dwarf is typically acknowledged to be about 4 heads in height. So this section right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, is how we're going to come across right here, and we're going to draw the dwarf. So if this is the size of the head of the dwarf, we need to make sure that this is our dwarf right here. So we'll try to keep that same head. So when you use the head as proportion, obviously if the whole figure is only 4 heads in height, that means when you're drawing a dwarf that the head is going to be very large in proportion to the human figure. So this would be the halfway point. And remember, this is the halfway point here on the pelvis and the great trochanter. So if we come across, that means that we're going to have, this is going to be that bottom section of the pelvis in here. And we'll just block in just a simple shape to begin. And then right here, let's go ahead and put this across. So this is where the feet are going to be on the dwarf. All right, so as you can tell, the head is very large in proportion to the figure of the dwarf. The halfway point is going to be this portion of the pelvis, and the top portion is going to come above. Now, a dwarf tends to be a little wider and thicker than it is tall. So it's okay to keep a little bit of girth on this guy. Then we come down here, and this is going to be the halfway point. So we know that the legs are going to come out in here, and this is where the knees are going to be placed. So I'll just do a real quick line indication so I know that I'm getting the proportions more or less correct. Now I have to fit the thoracic cage in here, and they would still have 12 ribs, but they're just going to be really wide and smaller. So here we go. Here's the rib cage through here and through here. So we can see this is very much like the cracked eggshell shaped. Same here. We had very much like the egg, upper and lower portion of the egg. Then we have the xiphoid cartilage in there and the sternum. Then we have the clavicles coming out. We're going to connect this with the vertebral column. We have the sacrum in here. In here we have this portion of the opening of the pelvis. And the width of the pelvis is usually very similar to the width of the rib cage. So we're going to have this top portion in here, top portion in here. And we have the ischium underneath. And now we'll add the legs. So here's the great trochanter, lesser trochanter, narrower. Then we have, and this is the femur, narrower, thicker. And then we have the tibia and the head of the fibula. And we have the feet, femur, tibia, head of the fibula, and the feet. Halfway point in here would be where the opening of the eyes are, eye sockets. Then we have the triangular nasal bone opening, maxilla, and mandible. And now we'll add the arms. So now, one thing that's interesting with a dwarf, they tend to have longer arms. So we will not end the elbow here. The elbow will actually continue down further. So here we have the head of the humerus, and right down in here is where we're going to have the elbow. It's down almost near the halfway point. Then we have the lower arm coming down here. And in the arms, we are going to have fall just slightly below the knees, and they would have larger hands. It's just a little gesture here, and there's the thumb in there. And same thing on the other side. So we come down here. So this would be the skeletal structure here that we have going of a dwarf. Even though the proportions and things change, they still have the same anatomical structure. So let's get the patella in here. They're still humanoid by nature, so it would have the same human structure. And then the dwarf tends to have tend to have large hands and large feet. So I'll make this wedge shape nice and big here. This wedge shape nice and large here. So as you can see, the body is thicker. It's relatively short and squat. And the head is very large. See, the head here is small in proportion to the full length of the figure, whereas the head here is very large in proportion to the dwarf figure. So when you're doing your gesture drawings, if you recall at the beginning of the year, sometimes you had your head very large, the legs pretty short, and so forth. And what you were actually drawing, rather than doing traditional human figure, your figures were looking more like a dwarf by comparison. So when you alter proportions, and you intentionally are altering proportions to do something very specific, it's okay. But when you're trying to do a realistic figure and you get your proportions a little off, it can make things look a little wonky. So the last one that we're going to do today, we are going to do an ogre. Most people are familiar with ogres in more recent times because of Shrek. Ogres go back quite a ways. A number of years ago, people were really familiar with ogres, more so from The Hobbit. For me, growing up, I was familiar with ogres from The Hobbit. But basically, when drawing an ogre, we'll do the skeletal structure again here of an ogre. Most people usually use a 9-head scale. So if you notice right here, we have 8 heads. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a 9th head. So something to think about is now is the head going to be big in proportion to the overall body, or is it going to be even smaller? So what it does is it's going to make it even smaller. So if we were to carry this all the way across, more or less here, and then we'd have, let's make sure we get enough room here on the page. So if we have the head in here, and we're just doing this using observational skills by eye. It's probably going to be somewhere, might be a little off here, but more or less. And so now we have 9 heads. So if we're going to go 4.5 heads down, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then half of the next head, this now will become the halfway point on the ogre. Because remember, this portion of the pelvis here, this portion of the pelvis here should be the halfway point on the full figure. So somewhere right in here is going to be, and we'll just draw in a real light, just a simple geometric shape of the lower part of a cracked egg. And then we know now that we have to then break this section from the top to here, and then from here to here would be the halfway point. So that halfway point is this portion of the rib cage. See, we have right here is half, and this is the other half. So more or less, this would be more or less the halfway point between here and here. So that's going to be the opening of our rib cage, the thoracic cage. And I'm going to keep it really light, just in case I need to make some changes here. I always want to give myself an opportunity to make corrections when needed. Then I will do a loose connecting portion of the vertebral column. And here is our opening of the pelvis. We've got the little ridge up in here, the iliac spine. Then we know, so now if this is the halfway point, then this right in here is going to be the halfway point for the knees. So we'll have the leg coming out in here, leg coming out in here, then we're coming down here, and we'll have the feet in here, and we'll have the feet in here. So I'm just doing a really loose, not straight. I want to have a little feeling of gesture drawing so that it's more creative and artistic, and I can alter these lines as I go. But it's essentially just a stick figure to get my block in, the quick gesture. Then I will come out here, and I'll add the humerus, radius, and ulna. Come out here would be the humerus, radius, and ulna. Gesture of a hand about right in here. Gesture of a hand about right in here. And now now that I feel things are kind of shaping up into more or less the right place, I can slowly go back and start adding in more detail based on knowledge of the anatomical structure. So here we have the manubrium is in here. This is the top portion of the sternum. And we have the gladiolus that comes down in here. And the little point that's here is the xiphoid process. Then we have the thoracic cage. And we don't need to draw every single individual rib, just the outlying area. And I'm going to simplify it to an egg-shaped oval. Then we have the vertebral column. Then the pelvis. Then the pelvis coming up in here. And ogres tend to be pretty big. So I'm actually going to give him a little more girth, and maybe I'll make the rib cage just a little bit wider. And then obviously they usually have a big belly. Well, you'll get to draw an ogre coming up in the next portion of this. So then we have the opening. You see the inside of the sacrum in here. And we'll go over the specifics with anatomy shortly. Then we have the ischium, and that falls below the halfway point. The halfway point is going to be somewhere in here. Then we have the head of the femur, great trochanter, lesser trochanter, coming down to our halfway point will be somewhere in here. So we have the inside of the femur. And I'm going to make these bones just a little bit thicker. But remember, it's still a little bit thinner in the shaft, and definitely thicker when it gets to the joints. It's got to support the weight. So then we have the tibia, medial malleolus of the tibia. Then we have the head of the fibula, and the fibula coming down here on the side. And ogres have really large feet. So again, on the other side, we have the head of the femur. Then we have the great trochanter, lesser trochanter. Nice, wide, strong joint. Patella in here. Patella in here. Common name would be a kneecap, but it's the patella. Tibia. Head of the fibula. And remember, this always is going to curve like this. When we get to adding muscles, the calf muscle is always lower on the inside and higher on the outside. But we'll get to that shortly. We'll be doing the legs in a few weeks. And And so now that we kind of have that blocked in, let's get the clavicle up here. Those come right in here. Then the edge of the manubrium, head of the humerus. Remember, just above the epicondyle, the pelvis is the medial epicondyle of the humerus. And then we have the radius. And see a little bit of the ulna there, then a gesture indication of a hand. Thumb would be in here, a couple of fingers. Humerus in here. Radius. So right in here, we have them about the same. We see a little bit of the ulna, and we want to have the gesture that we see here on the other side of the hand. A little bit of the thumb. And to fit the size of this figure, I'm going to make this bone just a little bit more pronounced. A little bit more pronounced. And we have the clavicle in there. And the head, so the halfway point would be the eye sockets of the head. Then the opening of the nasal cavity, the maxilla, and the mandible, and the back of the head. So I turned the head just a slight bit. So as you can see now with the ogre, the head is definitely smaller in proportion to the overall size of the human figure. So whenever you're drawing the figure, if you're going to be wrong and you're trying to do something that's kind of an epic fantasy feature, a super creature of sorts, you want to make sure that the head is small. We might see a little bit of the scapula actually in the back, so let's include that just a little bit here. You can do that on all of these, actually, because we would see a little bit of the scapula, because it forms the acromion process right up in here with the clavicle. It looks better. Looks funny without it. So, and there we have it. So, this is another pencil here. So this is an ogre. And ogres are typically 9 heads in height. This was the dwarf. And they're typically 4 heads in height. And this was the traditional proportions of a human, and it is 8 heads. Eight heads in height. All right. So here was the top of the 8 heads right here. This is the halfway point of the 8 heads. This is the base. The human, as you can see, the human figure is the full 8 heads. The dwarf only comes to 4. We added the additional head over here to get the ogre. The ogre is 9 heads in height. If you're going to do other figures, you can do like a barbarian is about the same set of rules as the ogre. Then the elf would be pretty similar to the human, but if you want to do a giant or some of the super characters, if you want to do a Hulk or Superman or one of the other, or any form of giant, sometimes they'll do giants where they'll draw the whole figure and the head would actually be between 12 and 14 heads high. So then the figure would just be massive, and there'd be this tiny little head inside of that figure. So the smaller the head gets, the more heroic the figure becomes. And if you want to do things that are really unusual, if you get little halflings, orcs, dwarfs, they all vary. Halfling may be 5 or 6 heads in height. The orc is thicker and stockier, and that might typically be somewhere around 6 or 7 heads in height. So you can mess around with, once you understand and master the rules of proportion, you'll know how to alter them to create all sorts of different characters and creatures. So it's really important to have a full understanding of traditional proportions. Then once you know all the rules, you can break them accordingly to suit your needs for whatever it is that you're trying to depict. So I'll take a little bit of time here and just go back and do some very quick shading in a time lapse so you can see what the skeletal structure here in this very simplified form would look like when it's shaded. And I hope this was helpful. I hope this gives you a much better understanding of how proportions work and how they can be utilized to draw all sorts of things related to the human figure. If some of you decide at some point you'd like to go into cartooning, doing animation for film, this is one of the most important things that you can learn in addition to actual anatomy, but you really have to have a thorough understanding of proportion, knowing exactly what the rules are and how to break the rules. So enjoy this.